In this episode of Weird Ass Books, Ice and Mercury by Anna Kavan. Welcome back to Weird Ass Books. I think when one first encounters the work of Anna Kavan, there are two biographical details about the author that immediately come bubbling to the surface. One is that Anna Kavan is not actually the author's birth name, it's a pseudonym. And in fact, it's a pseudonym that she took from one of the characters of her earlier works of fiction, semi-autobiographical fiction. And then the other detail that immediately strikes you is that she, for most of her adult life, was a heroin addict and in and out of mental institutions. Once you get past those two major details, there's actually quite an interesting, turbulent life. Anna Kavan was born Helen Emily Woods on April 10th, 1901. From the get-go, she had a pretty contentious relationship with her mother. Her father killed himself in 1911 when she was 10 or 11 years old. Helen Woods' first husband was actually the former lover of her mother that her mother pushed on her. Sort of speculation, although I think one of the biographies seems to claim it as fact. Although I have not read either of the two biographies that are available because they're kind of hard to get your hands on. So in 1923, I think she had a son with her first husband, and she actually left her first husband with her son. So from that point on, she sort of became interested in writing and painting and started pursuing those in London. And apparently she, through her painter friends and art friends, fell in with a group of race car drivers that are the ones who apparently introduced her to heroin. They were living this kind of crazy lifestyle, and I think she's quoted as saying something to the effect of their unique grasp on life and death and the ephemeral nature of life influenced her and her decision making. And, maybe that's just a highfalutin way of saying that she found like drug buddies. But anyway, that's how she got into using heroin, which at that time I believe was legal and could be prescribed by doctors. In 1929, she released her first novel, A Charmed Circle. Soon after, in the 1930s, the Anna Kavan character emerges from Helen Woods, who's publishing as Helen Ferguson at that point, her novel, Let Me Alone. And she adopted the name Anna Kavan both for her work and I think in her day-to-day life as well. She also dyed her hair blonde, apparently, bleached it. And at that point, her work became much more expressionistic and more avant-garde. Around that period, she marries an artist and kind of falls in with the art crowd. And she has a daughter with the painter Stuart Edmonds, and she dies very early in her infant childhood, after which is when it seems that Anna's life started to crumble and she attempted suicide and ended up in and out of psych hospitals and became kind of very close with a prominent psychiatrist. His name is Carl Theodor Bluth. During this period, she is addicted to heroin, sometimes trying to go into recovery, but basically always falling back on like this medical grade. I believe she was just getting prescribed heroin. I don't think it was a black market endeavor for her. And then in December 1968, Anna Kavan actually dies of heart failure, not directly from her addiction to heroin, although I believe I read a quote that said that there was enough heroin in her apartment to kill the entire block of residents. Some of this can be seen in her work, actually, including the posthumous short story collection, Julia and the Bazooka. The Bazooka being her euphemism or pet name for the syringe she used to shoot up. It's hard to not see her work through that lens, and especially the book Ice through that lens. And I think I should say at this point, I've maybe neglected that the relationship between Ice and Mercury, the two books I'm going to talk about, are inextricably linked because Ice was published in 1967 and Anna Kavan was a year away from dying, but she was fully embracing sort of that it was being embraced by the science fiction community, specifically Brian Aldiss. And then Mercury was published in 1994 posthumously, and it's speculated, and it's probably true, that it was an early draft for Ice, with a lot of the science fiction elements and a lot of the writing altered. And that link between those two books is maybe one of the main focuses of this episode today, but we'll get back there. Anna Kavan's work is a beautiful window into someone who was capturing interiority and a authentic, sort of dissociated and tragic, turbulent perspective. Much like a lot of other authors that will probably be featured on Weird Ass Books. There's a relationship between the terror and tragedy that people feel and how they express it in their art. So personally, the way that I came to Anna Kavan was through Aldous, who is one of, I think, the best science fiction writers of all time. And I did an episode about his book Hot House, episode 1. And I think his publisher sent him a copy of Ice. I don't know if he was actually aware of Anna Kavan's work before that, and he was a champion of Ice. And in fact, he wrote the foreword to the paperback version that I have. I believe in this introduction, Aldous recounts how he met with Anna Kavan, them both being in the UK. He referred to Kavan as Kafka's sister, and I think he really appreciated that although Ice is in no way a traditional science fiction book at all, it uses certain elements in a way that could be used to help push the genre of science fiction forward, because oftentimes science fiction, as I've talked about many times, can rely on certain tropes and fan service, whereas something like Ice is totally unique in any genre, but especially in science fiction. One way to think about books like Ice is using the term slipstream. Slipstream fiction is considered to be about the fiction of strangeness. And in I think it's the Penguin edition of Ice, the novelist Christopher Priest had a great quote about Ice that I think places it in the genre in a perfect way. He said, "The best way to understand slipstream is to think of it as a state of mind, or a particular approach, one that is outside of all categorization. Slipstream induces a sense of otherness in the audience, like a glimpse into a distorting mirror." So I think that's a helpful definition, or a helpful categorization. The closest thing I could even compare it to is the feeling you have in a dream, the dreams that I have often, where there's always the chance that everything can just curdle into a nightmare at any moment. If you wanted to put Ice specifically, and in some ways all of Anna Kavan's work, into a similar artist collection, I would put someone like Sylvia Plath, Anais Nin, of course Kafka, Ballard, who I've talked about. I would add Sadegh Hidayat's Bouffécourt, or The Blind Owl, to that list. Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet. Kavan's earlier work, you could say, has a lot of parallels to Doris Lessing. And of course, there's all the great isms and 20th century movements of the avant-garde in her work. Surrealism, expressionism, alienation, sadism, feminism. I think the closest I have encountered to what in art captures what Ice feels like is maybe something like Last Year at Marienbad, the film by Alain Resnais with a script by Alain robbe-grillet, especially because there's a love triangle and a liminality to it, and the way that scenes and time flows has a similar aspect, I think. So before I get more in depth about the actual content of Ice and Mercury, I just wanted to say that this copy of Ice I got online. I remember, I think it was around 2015 when I first read it and got the book. A gentleman named Terry B. Gertz, Gerts, had his stamp in the book. And I remember being, of course I'm going to Google Terry B. Gertz, and I think I just saw it was like an older gentleman living in Florida. And then when I reread the book recently to do this episode, I Googled Terry B. Gertz, and apparently he's passed recently, as I think 2020. So I just wanted to say thank you, Terry B. Gertz, for allowing it to leave your library and enter mine. Or I just find it exciting when someone's written their name in a book and I end up with it somehow, because I like thinking about the path that the book has taken to come to me or to anyone. So finally, to get to the actual content of Ice, it's a dreamlike, tenebrous experience. And the story, as it were, if you could call it a story in a traditional sense, is that there is an unnamed narrator who is visiting a couple. He is clearly obsessed with the woman, and the man always has this menacing antagonistic quality. So it's basically first-person protagonist, and then the antagonist and the woman, almost a damsel in distress. And then set amongst that sort of love triangle, a very weird love triangle, and we'll get into the reasons why it's so weird. There is this impending doom from a natural catastrophic event that has caused these ice shelves and these ice storms to just descend onto the this area, which is also unnamed. Among that, there's also very vague accounts of impending war that eventually does kind of affect the narrative. So the protagonist is obsessed with this woman who is described as being very fragile and waif-like and has blonde, almost bleach blonde hair, which you could easily make the connection that that is a stand-in for Kavan. But what's fascinating about the novel is that the female character has zero agency in the book and is only seen through the gaze of the male protagonist. I've read countless science fiction books where the female characters have zero or almost no purpose other than being sex objects. For this character to be treated that way by a female writer whose earlier work has been very concerned with the agency and freedom and ways in which society denigrates women. And, I'd like to say that you should be able to read it in a vacuum, but like if I knew that the author of this book was a man, I don't know if I would have the same reaction. In any case, the plot, as it were, and I think at this point, if you are a spoiler person, I'm just going to transgress every line that you might have. So if you're at all interested in reading these books and are spoiler phobic, move on. But the relationship between the warden, we'll call him, which is the antagonist, the woman, and the main character is always in this strange flux, and sometimes scenes flow into other scenes that are incongruous between these three people in a way that is hard to describe. It's like changing the light on an object, and you're just seeing a different shadow going around it. Not necessarily a different perspective, but everything about the relationship is slightly altered. It almost seems like they're in some kind of purgatory where their roles are just always the same, but in slightly different circumstances. Also, the protagonist from basically the jump tells the audience that he's always had an unstable or strange relationship with reality. So immediately you already know you're entering unreliable narrator territory. And in fact, it does seem like a lot of the science fiction elements are just hallucinations of the main character. Another aspect of the novel is that it's insinuated pretty early on and then more or less confirmed that the protagonist and the antagonist, the warden, are two sides of the same person, or in fact are the same person. And that the perceived abusive warden and the protagonist are both the same abuser of this woman who oftentimes in the scenes is in terror of both of these men. In an undescribable way, our looks tangled together, and this is the protagonist talking about him and the warden. I seemed to be looking at my own reflection. Suddenly, I was entangled in utmost confusion, not sure which of us was which. We were like halves of one being, joined in some mysterious symbiosis. I fought to retain my identity, but all my efforts failed to keep us apart. I continually found I was not myself, but him. At one moment, I actually seemed to be wearing his clothes. I fled from that room in utter confusion. Afterwards, did not know what happened, or if anything had. So, that's a good example of both how I think Kavan is making it pretty clear that the protagonist and the antagonist are the same person, but also the liminality of the novel overall. I believe it's a masterpiece, and like everything I love, it's not for everyone, but the dreamlike feeling you get when I read Ice was one of the greatest reading experiences of my life. So at this point, I really want to talk about Mercury because of its relationship to Ice. So like I said in the beginning of this episode, Mercury is often thought to be an early draft of Ice. It's unclear if Anna Kavan wanted this to be published because it was published posthumously in 1994. But regardless of that fact, I'm glad that I read it, although I do think Ice is the superior work, and I think it's the masterpiece that her entire life was leading to. But Mercury, if you love Ice, you should definitely check out Mercury, although for some maybe it would take away from the magic because you're seeing a more explicit version of something that's ambiguity and inscrutability and liminality and tenebrous quality were the draw. Mercury still is a work of oftentimes expressionistic prose, but it is clearly making literal or concrete, which in Ice was totally nebulous. So I actually first found this copy of Mercury, which I had never even heard of, at Bart's Books in Ojai, California. And Bart's Books is one of the greatest bookstores I've ever been to. It's sort of an open air, indoor, outdoor bookstore. I saw so many amazing things that I had never seen before at any bookstore before, used or otherwise. So I was really grateful that I found this book, Mercury. And when you first start reading Mercury, you immediately notice that the first chapter is about the Indri, which are lemurs. And one of the more incongruent aspects of Ice is that the protagonist is interested in these lemurs and their singing. And it seems sort of out of left field. And then in Mercury, you just start with that. So if you are a fan of Ice and you start reading Mercury, immediately you're like, whoa, whoa. And then you keep going, and you keep reading, and you're like, oh, the main character in this book is called Luke, but he's clearly the protagonist from Ice. The female character, who is unnamed in Ice, is Luz, or Luz. I think Luz. And then the warden character, or the antagonist from Ice, is called Chaz. And this book is written in third person, whereas Ice is written in first person from Luke's perspective. And in this book, the same dynamic is present. Luke is essentially trying to rescue or possess Luz, and Chaz, or the warden in Ice, is standing in the way and is a sort of an authoritarian being, but then is also suggested to be a different side of the same person as Luke. As you keep reading, you find that there are scenes that are essentially repeated in Mercury, or you could say are repeated in Ice than are in Mercury, which lends itself to the interpretation that the book is an earlier draft. Although if you wanted to have some kind of fun fan theory, you could say that the character of Luke in Mercury is dreaming what's happening in Ice. I think ultimately it's pretty clear that it's an early draft of Ice. But there are very similar themes in both. For example, there's a scene where the warden, or Chaz, puts on a record that Luke has given him, or the narrator from Ice, of the Indri singing. And the Indri singing is described in both books. And I watched YouTube videos to hear what it was like, but it's described as being very otherworldly, and there's some truth to that. But Luz hates this record, and she gets angry that you're just playing this to torment me. And that is a scene that's in both novels. There's also a very visually striking scene in both novels where the warden, or Chaz, is painting or is making an artwork of Luz, and the main character in Ice, or Luke in Mercury, walks by the room and sees him painting her, and he's like, it's weird that her arms are just so perfectly holding up above her head, and he realizes that she's actually has like wire bound around her, and she's being forced to pose in that way. And again, there's that theme of sadism and someone in distress that you have to rescue, a woman in trouble that you have to rescue throughout both novels. So an important lens to see the novel through is, I think, a feminist one, the lack of agency of women and women as objects. One aspect that I think that is poignant in Mercury, made it pretty explicit, is the way that men often project their desires on women and actually don't even see women or other people for who they really are, and more put people into certain roles or see them as they want them to fit into their own lives. And there's a passage on page 124 of this edition of Mercury that stood out to me. Suddenly then, it struck him that he never had seen her as she really was, but only in the role he had imposed upon her, as a sort of unreal blessed innocent, a lamb led to slaughter, viewing her always from the privileged position of her executioner. So the relationship between Mercury and Ice is clear, and I wish I had more insight into the intentions of the artist in terms of whether or not Mercury was something she would even want us to read. I know that she was proud of Ice and was, according to Aldous and others that I've read, was excited that it was being embraced by the science fiction community. That said, I think that if you don't like science fiction, Ice is not something that would be considered science fiction even by people who love science fiction. And in fact, I think people who love science fiction might want to just throw Ice into the dumpster. And like a lot of the work that I am fascinated by. It is difficult and it is frustrating in some ways, and there's a way that Kavan embraces confusion that I wouldn't expect everyone to want to experience. But for me, it is a truly mind-blowing masterpiece as far as I'm concerned, that, like all great works of art, can be viewed from an infinite amount of perspectives, an incredible work of art. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Weird Ass Books. I should say, actually, that there's a Prison for Kids song called Astillas, which was directly inspired by Ice, specifically the lyrics. But also, one thing I didn't mention before is that as the novel Ice goes on, there's like an acceleration of imagery and chaos and hallucinatory events. And in our song Astillas, which you can see a live version of on the channel, we did this accelerando into the final verse. And I just would thank everyone who's already subscribed to the channel. You guys have pushed us over 1,000 subscribers, and we really appreciate it. And we're excited to make more content and put it out there for you to enjoy, hopefully. And as always, you can go to prisonforkids.com for more information and check out Cesar's show, Vinyl Roulette. Thanks for watching.